So this is our AI Prompting Essentials for Education taster session, where Gray and Ruby are going to introduce NCFE's block and chat method. And this is part of our professional development week. So we're on our penultimate day of this. And I know I'm very much looking forward to seeing what Gray and Ruby have to showcase in that regard. So without further ado, I'm going to move on straight to Gray and Ruby. If you have any questions at any point, please put them in the chat, and we'll either pick them up as we go along, or we'll pick them up at the end in our Q&A session, depending on how we go through the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. My name's Gray. I'm going to be presenting the session with my colleague Ruby. And our hope today was to tell you about essentially two different ways of prompting generative AI, a block method that I've been working on and developing, and a chat method that Ruby's been developing and using in her work. And then we'll come together at the end and maybe combine those two things. My role at NCFE is in the innovation team, and I have the challenge, I guess, of trying to work out and navigate the opportunities and the challenges that AI brings NCFE. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. Ruby, do you want to just say hi and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ruby, and I work in the assessment design side of things. So I help develop T-level papers and other qualifications.
Fantastic. And Ruby is an expert user of generative AI, as we've learned over the last few months at NCFE. So we're really looking forward to sharing our knowledge with you. Okay, so we're going to start talking about block prompts. A block prompt is basically a relatively large set of instructions that you might give to a generative AI, and it has different elements to it. So you can see those on the screen. We have elements of giving the AI a role, giving it the context it needs to give us a good output, setting it a task or some tasks, and then giving it some detailed instructions about how we want it to go about that task. Normally, block prompts are sort of added to over time and refined. It's normal to have a kind of prompt library, I certainly do, on a Word document that's kind of opened really regularly, where block prompts can be kind of reused, like I say, added to and made better depending on the outputs that I get when I use them. Block prompts are often contain multiple tasks, so I want you to do all of these things one after the other, please, Mr. Generative AI. Within that, task one is often a task that isn't necessarily the outputs that I'm looking for, but it's more clarification that my block prompt has worked essentially, and that generative AI has understood the area of work that we're currently dealing with. And I'm going to show you a block prompt now, so you can sort of see these things in action. So if we start off with role, we can see here, but by the way, I'm using a block prompt that we have used in real life at NCFE, that I helped develop when I was working with some of the assessment solutions team. And this particular example is very much a practical example of an NCFE colleague using generative AI. You may want to kind of substitute this use case, which is creating your assessment items, with your own use case, which might be creating learning resources or other teaching and learning things. But that's the example that we're going to use. So you can see here what I'm giving to the generative AI tool is I'm telling it what I do in my role. So I'm an assessment specialist writing new items for a particular curriculum. And then I've put in there what I want the generative AI to do. Your role is to assist me to do this. And that's quite an important distinction, because I need to stay in control of this and stay in charge. So I'm using the AI tool to help me do my work essentially, and not replace me and do my work for me. So that's role, and you see role, see we finish here with these 3 forward slashes. That indicates to the AI that I'm moving on to a different part of the prompt. So we'll see that come up fairly regularly. The next bit I mentioned was around context. So this is quite a lot of text on this slide. I don't imagine that you're going to read it all for a second, but just to sort of give you the high level, there's two parts of this context. One is some particular element of the curriculum that I want to write a question and assessment item about. This one is to do with constructivism theory in teaching and learning. And all I've done here is I've copied and pasted an element of the specification for the particular qualification that I'm working on. Nothing more and nothing less. So that just goes straight in there for the generative AI to give it the context of the topic that I want a question on. And then the second bit of context is the assessment objectives for that particular qualification. And again, these have been taken directly from the specification for this particular qualification. And again, I'm just trying to tell the AI that I want, when I ask it to do some tasks, I want it to do it on these particular topics. I want this topic in terms of the subject, and I want questions that analyze these particular assessment objectives. Moving on then, I've got a set of tasks here that I want the generative AI to do for me in order. So very briefly, I've got task one, which is that check for me that AI has understood what I'm asking it, the tool has understood. So I've asked it to summarize cognitive constructivism for me. Like I mentioned before, I don't need it to do this. This is not going to add to my knowledge or anything, but it's purely a question to check that the generative AI has understood what I want it to do. Then task two is asking it to create an assessment item in a particular scenario that I've made up, and which assessment elements I want to cover. Task three is to give me a scenario that is attached to that question that puts it for the learner in kind of the practical context that we use at NCFE. And then task four is asking it for basically a mark scheme or the indicative content that I use. So you can see kind of sequentially, I'm asking the generative AI to work through 4 different tasks. And again, you can see a few things I wanted to point out here. I've got the 3 forward slashes because I'm separating that from the previous context element of the block prompt. And then I've been really purposeful in how I've created the task list. So I've given it task numbers with a hyphen and then the task and task 2 hyphen and the task and so on. And one of the, I guess, criticisms of this sort of method is that you can overwhelm the AI, which is definitely a true criticism. And so what I'm trying to do here is to lower the risk of that happening by being really clear and setting out the tasks in this way. And then the last element of the block prompt is the instructions. So these are things that I want the generative AI to be considering as it is using, as it's creating my output, sorry. So I've got clear and concise language for a particular age of learner that we're targeting here. I've got some specific items about the indicative content, so that was the mark scheme. And I'm reminding it to use UK English spellings. And if I didn't have these instructions, more than likely the output that I get would need much more refining because it's not exactly how I want it. And to be honest, when we were developing this particular block prompt for a colleague, these instructions were built on over time based on the outputs that we got out. So a good example of that is where it says provide at least 8 bullet points. We were getting a mark scheme that would maybe have 2 or 3 bullet points for each of the items that we wanted, and which just wasn't quite comprehensive enough. So you can see that we're sort of refining our block prompt as we go, and these instructions, like I say, can get kind of added to over time. So then just to see the whole thing, again, please don't read this, but just to give you the overview, I've got my role, I've got those 3 slashes before I then go on to the context in those 2 elements. Again, go on to the tasks and then go on to the instructions. And if I just think about this block prompt as a whole and think about reusing it, actually at least half of the context is reusable because it's the assessment objectives that probably won't change over time and certainly won't change for this particular use case as I build up some sample assessment material. The subject context, so the constructivism theory context, will change, so I can swap that out for another part of the curriculum fairly easy. And some of the tasks will change because I've got some specific tasks around constructivism. I've got a specific task around a maths lesson, and those things may well change, of course, over time. But the rest of the block prompt, and certainly the structure of it, I can keep, and I can keep reusing and keep refining in the future to hone my outputs. Okay, so why do we use block prompts, or why do I use them? So the first point is it's a way of having a really good starting point for prompting AI that I can continually improve over time. So based on the outputs I can get, I can change those instructions, I can change how I word the task and things. But in the main, I'm going to get to a point where I've found the optimal way of doing it for that particular use, and so I'm going to kind of save that and bank it for the future, and I can share it with colleagues really easily, so they can build on my work, or I can build on their work if they share things with me. So it's a way of making sure we're improving our use of generative AI. We use the key prompting principles, some of which you've seen there, in terms of giving the AI a role, its context, and some clear instructions. And it may be a way to lower the barrier to entry for generative AI, in that if you just don't know where to start, then building a block prompt or getting one from a colleague that you can then start to use yourself and adapt is just a really relatively easy way to get started with using generative AI, because you've got a structure there that you can understand and use. And you'll probably find that you'll then go on to refine it and find your own way of using generative AI in slightly different ways. So I'm going to come back in a few minutes and show you a block prompt in action. But before I do that, I'm going to hand over to Ruby, who's going to tell you about her method of using generative AI using chat prompts.
Thanks, Gray. Okay, so I use large language models, or AI, slightly differently. So I speak to it more like a person. So we will have a lot more back and forth. Rather than creating a big block prompt, it will just be a series of small prompts. It'll be a lot less organized, but it allows me to have more control over each part of a task. So it allows me to refine each part, so I get exactly kind of what I want. And it means that I have to think very carefully about what I want the AI to do. And then it allows me to be quite active in the process. I'm using it kind of more as an assistant, kind of in real time. So I'm going to show you an example of how I use it. As I work in assessment design, I might be involved with creating practice papers or sample materials. So we might create some sample questions. Again, these slides are quite text heavy. I'm not expecting you to read it all. I'll just explain kind of what I did. So I've given a bit of context. So I've written that I work for an assessment organisation, and I've said, well, we're going to create some prompts. We're going to create some, assessment items together. And then I give it kind of a bit of a background. So it's about education and early years T-level. I haven't given it very specific instructions, but sometimes it's useful just to see what the large language model will say. It gives you some ideas about what you might talk about next. It keeps things open, sort of allowing for a bit more creativity. But to be honest, I already had in mind what I was going to do next. So next I sort of put in part of the qualification specification. So I've said, okay, I'm going to put in part of the qual spec, and this is what we're going to test on. So I've just pasted part of the qualification spec. And I also said, I want to focus on a particular type of question, and I've highlighted what kind of question that is. So it's an AO2 question. And what I wanted it to do was generate 3 scenarios. So AO2 questions always have a scenario. Generate 3. So that allows me to choose, and it keeps it, again, creative and interesting. And you can see kind of different qualities, or it helps you kind of choose what it is that you want. So it did produce 3 scenarios, but I just chose one. And sometimes it can come out really long, so you can end up with really long scenarios, but you can always ask it, just say, okay, well, that's a bit long. Can I please have it a bit shorter? But actually on this occasion, it was a good length and roughly what I was looking for. So I've sort of perfected the scenario kind of quite quickly. But I have to check. I want to always be sure about what the large language model is doing, what the AI is doing. So I say, okay, but it really definitely needs to test this part of the qual spec. So what I did was I've sort of asked it for a justification in a sense. I've said, well, which part of the spec does that bit test? So then I've checked through the justification of what the AI has said. And once I was happy, I was like, okay, yes, that is what I was wanting to look at. I moved on to thinking about the question. So the scenario bit's done. Next, we're looking more carefully at the question. So what I started with was, okay, this is the scenario. The question needs to start with either maybe explain or describe, and I've asked it to write the rest of the question with the specification in mind. So it's always important to reiterate what's important, what is important for the AI to consider at that time. So that's why I mentioned the qual spec again. And it came up with something and it wasn't actually what I wanted. It sort of came up with a question. It was a good idea, but it wasn't how I wanted it. So then I was a bit more specific. I said, well, the question needs to be just one line. So it needs to start off, explain how, ... And then I've let the AI do the work for me and come up with a question. To improve this further, you can even, if I had a question to hand, I could have put an example in. So AI responds really well to examples, just as kind of a person would really. And then it came up with something much more acceptable. Then I moved on next. So after you do your question, you want to think about obviously the mark scheme or what the answers are going to be. So I said, okay, I want to generate some indicative content for the question. I put again the scenario just to remind it and make sure that the answer will be given, it will give that more weight. And then I've given some instructions about what the mark scheme would look like. And then in this case, I also put an example. Again, like Gray had done, I've separated using 3 forward slashes. That just helps to communicate to the computer which bits are separate, just so that it doesn't blur the instructions together. You can also use like asterisks, or you can use hashtags. They work in the same way. And then it came up with some answers. As I read through, I thought, yeah, they're okay, but I really preferred sort of 3 and 4, number 3 and 4. They were more on the mark. So I said, okay, I like answer 3 and 4. Can we build on that some more? Can we have some more ideas? And reiterated what was positive about those two. So I said, I didn't want the answer already in the scenario, and I wanted it to offer an explanation. So you just point out what was good. And then that really did help give me exactly kind of what I wanted and gave me more of more helpful indicative content. So that's just an example of how I would use it. And I think this is, I prefer working in this way rather than block prompts, as I feel like AI can sometimes react more like a person. If you overload it, it's never really sure what weight to give what, and you've got less control over it. I also find that it stops the output, so what you get back from AI, being very overwhelming. And it makes sure that each stage of what you're working on is perfected. It's exactly as you want it. From a layperson, it might seem like what it produces by itself is fine, but really you want to check it at each stage. So yeah, I'm just going to hand back to Gray.
Thanks, Ruby. So there's 2 methods there, and you could just take either of the methods and just use them as they are. That's fine. There is the potential here. Sorry, I've just got to navigate back to my correct slides. 2 seconds. There is a potential here, though, to combine them. And the reason that this might work particularly well is that even using a block prompt, it's very unlikely that that first output that you get is what you want, is the finished article. And in fact, we would advocate for the fact that you should probably never accept the first output from generative AI, because it's unlikely to be as good as you can make it with some follow-up prompting. So then that brings in the idea of that we can do both of these things potentially, and so combining this, you could end up with the best of both worlds. So for example, you've got a structured prompt that you can continually work on and improve, like I was mentioning before, to do with those instructions or the layout of it, but also remain active in the process and remain in charge. Essentially, you're not being led by the computer. You're telling it what you want. It might be a way of sharing good practice, i.e., you can share your block prompts with colleagues and say, "Here you go, give this a try," but also at the same time remain agency of the process and maintain agency. And it might be a way of thinking about prompt principles to do with role, context, targeted instruction, but also not necessarily have that kind of full level of overwhelm, maybe for the AI tool or for yourself, and can work either way. So I am going to quickly change my screen, if you just give me 1 second, and I'm just going to show you this in action, basically. And we're going to give it a go. So what you should be able to see now, hopefully, is my Copilot screen. Copilot is personally one of my preferred generative AI tools, but that's not me endorsing it. And I think actually when it comes to choosing a tool, the prompting is more important than the tool itself, or it's certainly worth getting that right first. So you might use another tool, and that's obviously completely fine. So I'm just going to put in the prompt box here that exact same block prompt that I just went through. We're saying exactly the same topic area that I've used, that Ruby's used in her examples. And I'm just going to press go on that. So if you remember that the block prompt was asking the generative AI tool to, based on the context that I gave it, create it was going to give me an overview of the context in task 1. It was going to give me a question and a scenario in task 2, which it's done, as you can see, and it's given me the indicative content to the mark screen. So it's carried out my 4 tasks exactly as I wanted it, and it's given me the I guess confidence to go on. But like I say, that initial output is unlikely to be the finished piece. And so now I'm going to have to start using some of Ruby's ideas to start manipulating this output. So for example, I'm looking at this question, and it's a really general question. So it's saying about a maths lesson for 5-year-olds, but I want my question to be much more a bit narrower than that on a particular area. So I'm just going to ask the AI to make this about a particular part of maths. I don't care too much that I've got a typo in there, because the AI doesn't mind that too much. And so it's given me a different output, and you can see that I'm starting to make those adjustments. In fact, it hasn't given me a different output, so I'm going to ask it to do it again. Make the question about a specific part of the maths curriculum. Maybe I should have phrased that a bit better in the first place. So here we go. I've got a particular part of the maths curriculum about number bonds. Oh my gosh, number bonds in my family with my young children at the moment are all the rage, so I definitely know about that. But you can see I'm starting to refine this output, and now of course I've now got to do the same refinements on the other parts of the output. So very much like Ruby was saying, I'm now having a conversation with the tool, and I'm going to be back and forth asking it to update the indicative content. Based on that new output, I might have to then go and change the scenario and so on and so forth. And what I end up getting, so I've got an indicative content here that's specifically about number bonds, whereas before it was a really generic output. So hopefully you can see that then although I started off with my big block prompt at the beginning that has all my kind of prior understanding of LLM tools and how best to use them, but I still would never expect that to be the end point. I'm going to start then chatting with it and using some of Ruby's principles. Okay, let me just quickly head back to the slides, and I'm going to hand over back to Ruby. Oh, sorry, Ruby, I just took control from you by accident. Do you want to take it back? Press the wrong button. There we go.
That's all right. Hang on, can you just click? Oh, goodness.
We'll get there.
Sorry. Like, never has anything moved so slowly now that I need it to go quicker. Right. So, to finish off, there's lots of different things out there for creating a good prompt. Some of the easiest things to do are adding the 3 slashes as we demonstrated, just to break things up a bit, just so that the LLM understands that there are different parts to that prompt. Be careful of your use of must. So must is given a higher weighting. So if you write down, you must make this 6 lines long, it's going to put like a more emphasis on that and might give less emphasis to other parts of your prompt. So use it kind of sparingly, or just be aware of where you're going to use that. It's good to iterate to it the depth of detail that you are asking it for. So the more examples you can give, or the more explanation you can give to the AI about the depth of detail you want, the more it's going to produce something that you want. It's useful to ask for UK English spellings and to basically check any outputs that it gives you. Things are increasingly getting more and more accurate, as when I first started using it in, say, 2022, outputs were a lot less accurate, but as time has gone on, things have become more accurate, but it's still really important to check everything, including spelling. It's useful to also separate your tasks, so numbering things 1, 2, 3, anything to make it more clear to the large language model, you're going to get a better output. And there are other prompt things you can do, kind of like asking the model to say, do you understand everything that I've asked you for? Ask me any questions you have before completing the task. So in that way, you can kind of improve your prompt and get AI to even improve your prompt for you. So that brings us towards the end of the session, but we do have a little bit of time for questions. So if anyone's got any questions, you can either type them in chat or come off mic.
People are warming up to ask a question. If I don't mind, I've got one for Gray and one for Ruby to share. You in the roles bit, Gray, is it useful for the AI to know your role? Because you say you've specified what role it has. Does it help to give the context whether you've told them who you are? Would it help if you were an educator? Say I'm an educator, I'm a teacher. Does it help them in that?
I think the most important thing is that you give the AI its role. So that's paramount, if you like. So you have to do that. I think it's actually useful context for the AI to know why you're asking it to do it, to do the task that you've asked. So that's why I had in my role bit. This is what I do. I'm creating some assessment items, blah blah blah, and I want you to help me basically. So that's how I found it works well. But like I say, the most important thing is it's got a role.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you. Actually, we've got a question. Is it better to give it a word count, i.e. describe in 100 words?
Well, funnily enough, generative AI is not good at counting. So the 100 words is probably not going to work too well for you. But what you can do is iterate on what you get. So it definitely understands more and less. So if you want longer, more comprehensive output, then you can definitely ask for that based on what you first get. And if you want shorter, more succinct summaries, then you can ask it for that. But you probably won't find you'll get 100 words if you ask for it in the first instance. I don't know why that is, but that's just a quirk.
Yeah, like strawberries, how many R's are in strawberries? Fabulous, thank you. And Ruby, for those that are thinking, I really want to do this, but how much time is it going to take me to learn how to do this versus me just thinking about it and creating it myself? How would you say that time takes in that initial journey of how long it takes to learn to effectively prompt to then being able to use it more comfortably and efficiently?
I think it was just a case of more experimentation and using it and having the confidence to talk with it like a person. You can be limited a little bit by, if you were using a free version, you might end up with, sometimes they stop you after a while, you've used too many prompts. But if you have access, Gemini, for example, has a lot less restriction around it. It's just trial and error and converse with it kind of like you would a person. I think that's the best way to go about it.
Brilliant, thank you. That's it for questions for now, I think. I think we can move on to the last few slides.
Okay, so just to finish off then, and thanks for listening, everyone. A couple of last slides from us. Ruby and I are going to be back doing a follow-on session to this in a few months' time as part of a further sort of professional development series. So do have a look out for that event. Tracy's just put the link for you in the chat. It is a paid for session, but it will dive more in depth into some of the things we talked about today. And importantly, we'll get people working with a couple of AI tools and sort of putting things into practice. So do definitely look out for that. And the last slide from us has some useful links on some of the other AI publications and things that we put out there, including some guidance for customers and so on. So I will put those links in the chat now, and you can have a click around. They're not about generative AI necessarily, they're just general kind of set of useful things for you. And with that, I think I'm going to hand back to you, Tracy.
Fabulous, thank you. Yes, and my final request is just to give the feedback for today's session as well. I very much value what your thoughts are, and even in the extra comments, what else would you like to see? You know, what's maybe causing you to become undone by AI, or have you got a bit that you're stuck and you don't know where to go next? It always helps us understand more around what it is that you are looking for to help you feel confident in using AI effectively as part of your role. So definitely would value your feedback. I will follow up with these slides as well, and this recording will be available from the 8th of January. Just with it being Christmas in between, it's just going to take a little bit longer to get that up onto YouTube at this time of year. And please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all. So thank you very much for joining us today on this taster session. Thank you, Gray, and thank you, Ruby.
Thanks, everyone. See you again.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.